Hello and welcome to World History Encyclopedia's podcast, where we put your questions to archaeologists, historians and curators, our experts on history. I'm Fiona Richards, and I'm delighted to be here today talking to Dr Louise Pryke. After growing up on a sheep farm in rural central western New South Wales, Louise completed her secondary education by correspondence. She graduated from the University of Sydney with a PhD in ancient history and has taught courses in ancient languages and literature at Macquarie University and the University of Sydney. She's the author of 4 books. Welcome, Louise.
Oh, thanks, Fiona. It's lovely to be here.
Now, I must just go back to your secondary education by correspondence, because many listeners might not actually know that that's something that can happen in a country like Australia.
Yes, well, it's quite interesting, really, because students in Australia can do school by correspondence for all kinds of different reasons, and particularly because of Australia being such a big place and parts of it are quite remote. There's something wonderful called the School of the Air, which isn't how I did things. I was on a sheep farm, but I wasn't quite that remote. But the School of the Air tends to look after people that are so remote and sort of, does a lot of bringing in, it used to do a lot of things over the radio where students would learn things by listening to the radio, but now, the internet's come in and that kind of thing. But it just goes to show there's just so many ways to get an education, many different roads up the mountain.
And did you always want to be a historian?
Well, actually, I wanted to be an astronaut.
Excellent.
But firstly, maths is never really on my side. But also, I feel like being an astronaut and being an historian are kind of the same thing in a way, because it's all about thinking of the big picture. Like, you're thinking about the world. We are here for such a brief moment. And I just love that sense of perspective that you get from astronomy or from history, where you start looking around and getting this sense of what an amazing world we're in, or universe even.
That's fantastic. As you know, at WHE, we love history. That's what we're all about. I love the way you've just described that. I understand that for your research, it was all about ancient literature in the ancient Near East. So where did that come from as well?
Oh, I think that came from, I just love stories of any kind. And I love how much stories tell us about being human. And I think that if you study, a lot of my research, I'm quite fortunate to be looking at some of the world's oldest stories that have been written down, like the Epic of Gilgamesh. And that makes me really interested in how people have been using storytelling, the storytelling kind of device, to try and understand the world and our place in it for seemingly as long as we've had civilization. And I would warrant longer than that as well.
Fantastic. So in your introduction, I mentioned that you'd written 4 books. Now, there's one on Gilgamesh and Ishtar, who are 2 Mesopotamian characters, shall we say. But the other 2 are on animals. There's the scorpion and also the turtle. So can you tell us why we have 2 animal books in there with the 2 Mesopotamian characters?
Well, it's a great question, and one that I feel I often receive from colleagues as well. But for me, I feel like it's all history. There's a world of history out there, and you don't want to just, it's fascinating to learn about human history, but there's so many other animals on the planet that have also had amazing histories. And the turtle book and the scorpion book, they both look at the cultural history of that animal, and so what the animal has meant throughout human history, which I just think is a really fun and informative lens through which to look at at a really wide spectrum of human existence. So yeah, they're pretty fun, and you learn some pretty cool things about animals while you're doing it. So also, they're super old as well. So I feel like that's, if I have anything that unites it all together, and it's arguable that I do, then I would say, look, scorpions were older than dinosaurs. Turtles sort of maybe turned up around the same time that dinosaurs did. So I just really like ancient things, I think.
That's a fantastic fact. I don't think I knew that scorpions were older than dinosaurs.
They are amazing, and they have stayed roughly the same shape because, when scorpions started out, they kind of got it right the first time. So they are amazing sort of prehistoric little guys.
Yeah. And turtles. Well, we'll come back to turtles later because we can't not talk about turtles. And I have to say, thank you very much for talking to us today about Mesopotamian things because of Gilgamesh and Ishtar. So we've had quite a few questions from our WHE readers. So I shall jump right in with them. And some of them are a bit long, but we'll get through them. So let's start off with a question from Muriam, who would like to know, Firstly, in the early Babylonian Empire by Hammurabi, and secondly in the Neo-Babylonian Empire by Nebuchadnezzar II, the city god Marduk gained a lot of importance, especially in Babylon and Mesopotamia. Thus, can we say, in both Hammurabi's and Nebuchadnezzar's reign, but especially in the latter's reign, that Marduk was a catalyst to form a united Babylonian culture and society?
Wow, that is a really informed and thoughtful question. I'm very impressed by your readers. And the short answer is yes, you probably could look at them as you could look at Marduk as playing that catalyst role. But of course, with history, it's always more complex than a simple yes or no. And so Marduk thought those less informed was like the primary deity of Babylon. So he was the city god. And he kind of starts out as being the city god in Babylon. And then his role really, I mean, the question kind of went from like old Babylonian to Neo-Babylonian, which is, hundreds and hundreds of years. And Marduk changes throughout that time and becomes more preeminent and goes from being sort of the city god of Babylon to becoming the ruler of the whole Mesopotamian pantheon and indeed the whole Mesopotamian universe. So he gets right up to the top of the tree. And the thing that unites the questioners to historical figures, which was Hammurabi, the famous lawgiver, and Nebuchadnezzar II, is that they were both really well known for their abilities to, well, they're both warrior kings, and they both brought Babylon, they elevated the status of Babylon. And as they did that, Marduk's status was also elevated. And so yes, I think this catalyst idea is a nice fit.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, now we have a question now from Devansh, who is a student in economics and technology in Turkey, and he would like to know, do we actually know that the superpowers that we call myths are really myths, or just because of lack of proofs and evidence we call them myths?
I love this question. That's really interesting, and I would love to know the answer to that too. I certainly think that the jury is still out, but what I can say is that if we're talking about Mesopotamia, then what we're looking at usually in Mesopotamian myths are texts or literature that blends together the historical and then the kind of mythical. So you'll have things that are rooted in sort of historical events or even historical persons potentially, but then at the same time, they'll be doing sort of magical things like flying up to heaven on the back of an eagle, which we think is probably the more mythical side of things. But at the same time, I mean, some of the things that are attributed to myth, we've found can actually seem to have quite a good basis in what might be historical fact. And so it really is a question, as your questioner has noted, of not having enough evidence to really know either way. I will say in Mesopotamia as well, we start to see the first, I like the reference to superpowers because we get to see some of the people with the first, in narratives, we start to see people with some of the first superpowers who are sort of comparable to sort of Marvel Avengers. We have Gilgamesh with his super strength, and then we have Lugal Banda, who actually is bestowed with super speed and can kind of, he's like the Flash of ancient Mesopotamia. So yeah, so it's definitely this idea of being able to transcend the mortal limitations certainly has a very long history in human thought.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, we have one from Karen now, and I think I've read that you're very interested in the flood myths as well. So she has a question which says, regarding world flood myths stroke narratives, what are your favourite theories? How relevant is Pangaea given that so many cultures have their own surprisingly similar flood stories? She writes, I have read very briefly about the thought that human genetics somehow have encoded memories, and she wonders if the flood narrative might in some way be such a thing. What is your opinion, please, Louise?
Well, this is kind of a huge question. And again, it's one of those things that we probably don't have a definitive answer for yet. But Karen's definitely right in that we do see a lot of ancient flood narratives in a lot of different cultures. And, so sort of Chinese culture, Greek myth. And then famously, you've got the Gilgamesh flood narrative, which seems to be somehow related to the biblical flood narrative of the book of Genesis. there's a lot of overlap, but there's also a lot of difference between all these different flood narratives. And so I think with the reference to sort of terraforming and how the continents kind of came together, look, I'm not really sure how much evidence we have for what stage in human history certain things might have happened in terms of a flood. But I will say they did find, I think recently, I think it was something like 7,000 years ago, that there seems to have been evidence for sort of silt that might have come from a giant flood that was found in areas that weren't previously considered to have been anywhere near a large body of water. And so I think it's something that people keep finding. But what I will say about this that I think is really interesting is that often what we find in literature is echoes of human experiences, but they've been part of an oral tradition or part of stories that we don't know that have disappeared, that get passed down for such a long time. And then when we receive them, we don't realize there's a historical kernel to them. So this, for example, with in Gilgamesh, book 5, he and Enkidu, his like wild man friend, they get to the forest of cedars and they think the forest of cedars is so beautiful and they admire them, and then they chop them down and they get into a lot of trouble because they're like it's a sacred forest. So deforestation wasn't a good look back then either. And what was really interesting about this was when I was talking about this in publications, I was in touch with a very learned scientific person who said to me, did you know that actually there is evidence of forest clearing in that area from about sort of 9,000 BCE all the way up to around the time that the Gilgamesh stories would have started to have been written down. So it's almost like the Gilgamesh stories are giving an etiology or like an explanation of how those forests ended up being chopped down. And that's something that I didn't know about the stories. I didn't know there could be that historical background. And so I think we've got a lot left to discover.
Fantastic. And perhaps now we should just have a quick chat about Gilgamesh because, well, number one question, was he a mythical figure or was he a real person?
Nobody's quite sure. And so he does appear on the Sumerian king list, which does have historical kings on it, sort of towards the end. But towards the beginning of it, it's got historical kings, well, presumably historical kings that lived for hundreds of years and are thought to have perhaps been legendary figures or sages or similar. And so where he fits into that, it's hard to tell, but it does seem that if he was a historical figure, he probably would have reigned around the time of sort of, I think it's like 2700 BCE, and then the stories would have evolved from there.
Okay, and so tell us a little about the actual Epic of Gilgamesh, because I believe it's the oldest piece of epic world literature. Is that right to say?
Well, at least that's, yes, as you say, literature written down. So I mean, many cultures have similarly ancient stories, but the one that we have written down is the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it basically follows the story of the heroic young king Gilgamesh, who starts out as being a tyrant. And he lives in Uruk, and he is basically oppressing all of his subjects. And this isn't really how kingship's meant to work. And so the story of Gilgamesh is basically how not to be a good Mesopotamian king, because he kind of does everything wrong. But the people get fed up with him and they go to the house of the gods and they say, can you fix this, please? And they say, sure. And so they create Enkidu, who is a hairy wild man sidekick. And the two of them go on these fabulous adventures to the Forest of Cedars. And then they get into a fight with the goddess Ishtar. They do battle with the Bull of Heaven, which is this massive bull that we think might be related to the constellation Taurus. And it was meant to be so big that with every snort of its breath, it created these giant sinkholes and people would just fall in. So everything is kind of on a major epic scale in Gilgamesh. Spoiler, Enkidu dies because of some of their transgressions. Gilgamesh is absolutely devastated. It is quite beautiful. There's a whole passage about how, he tries to stir Enkidu, but he doesn't get any response. And it's just very tragic. And so then he clothes himself in the skin of a lion and he goes roaming and he goes across. He's looking for the secret of eternal life. He doesn't want to end up how Enkidu did. And so he wants to live forever. And he travels across the borders of death, goes through the path of the sun, ends up in this sort of jeweled forest. And he finally meets this legendary flood survivor. who tells him that actually he doesn't have the secret to eternal life, but he can have the secret to renewed youth, which Gilgamesh takes as a kind of runners-up prize, hangs on to it for about 5 minutes, and then loses it to a snake. And the snake eats this herb of eternal youth, and it sheds its skin and becomes young again. And we think that's kind of an etymology for how snakes shed their skin. But then at the end of this, Gilgamesh goes back home and he looks at the walls of Uruk, and he seems to understand that there's going to be some kind of immortality for him in the works of civilization. And at the same time, the writers of the epic seem to also be saying there's immortality in writing, because they talk about how the tablets that the epic's written on are kind of hidden in the foundations of the city of Uruk.
Fabulous. So do we actually know who wrote this epic?
Well, it looks like it was one of those things that's been handed down in multiple versions, but a very well-known version was sort of around 1200 BCE by Sin Lake Unini, who was kind of a priest and an exorcist and magician. And he is known for pulling together the edition that we call the standard Babylonian version of the Gilgamesh epic, which is a very important version. It's unusual because a lot of these Mesopotamian works of literature tend to be anonymously written, or if we do get an author, they'll be like a legendary sage or so.
There's so many things in the story, aren't there? So the person who wrote it is actually interweaving so many different stories and morals and everything in there, isn't there? So it'd be quite nice to know actually who the person was who wrote it, I think. But we'll never know that.
Maybe someone who's listening will one day figure it out.
That would be great. Or we could get in our time machine and go back. I'm really keen on time machines, I have to say. Okay, we have a question from Brennan now, who would like to know, why do many ancient religions share the thread of overthrowing the old gods and replacing the pantheon with newer ones?
Well, I don't know, but it's a very good question. It is definitely a trend. I mean, Brennan is absolutely right there. And what I think a lot of scholars who sort of pursue this kind of line of inquiry generally focus on either the religious or the political motivations in forming a new pantheon, because obviously in the ancient world, the religious is political and politics is religious. And so if you're having an old pantheon being overthrown by a bunch of new deities, often they're looking at, who is trying to capitalize on their political power. And so much power came through the religious world. So I think that that's one explanation. On the other hand, I mean, if you just think about things like the transition from the Greek gods to the Roman ones, where there's a lot of overlap, I feel like sometimes with cultures, the culture changes so fast that in a way it's hard for the deities to change as fast and sort of keep up with the change. And so a way around that is to sort of find new ways of imagining those gods. But at the same time, you've got to kind of, people are fascinated with the origins of things. In ancient wisdom literature, we see a lot of focus on creation stories and on how things started, because that's a sign of wisdom. To know how something started is to know it really, really well. And so you're going to need to have these origin stories, and also people are going to remember that there were deities before the ones that you have now. So I feel like these stories of deities being overthrown for a new pantheon, they kind of serve kind of a lot of different purposes.
Do you think there might be an element of just simply younger men with new ideas, something like that as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that religion is always changing to sort of meet new ideas and to meet new circumstances. It can be quite a fluid thing, religion, and gods as well, how they are conceived of. So yes, absolutely.
Fantastic, thank you. Let's just move on to Ishtar, which one of your books was about as well, because I find her fascinating because she's both the goddess associated with love and war. Mm-hmm. So you'd think that was sort of an opposite. So it's a very interesting combination.
Yes, Ishtar is so fabulously interesting. So she is the first, she's the first deity for which we have written evidence globally. And she's also the first love goddess. So I think most people are familiar with Aphrodite, but Ishtar kind of got there first. And she seems to have lent some of her image to Aphrodite. So some of her image has kind of lasted. Unfortunately, a lot of it has been lost, probably due to the loss of cuneiform written traditions for thousands of years. But yes, so she is the goddess of love, social connectedness, but also war. But a lot of those things about her that seem like they're really far away from each other, they kind of overlap in really cool ways. And I was thinking about in my book that her relationship with the king, because she has a very loving relationship with the Mesopotamian king. In some cases, they sort of marry one another. And so in this relationship, so she loves the king, but she goes out and fights for the king because of that love. And so the love and the war, they're kind of related. So they're not as disparate as they might seem. One of her other roles is that she is her twin brother, is the solar god, and Shamash. And Shamash, being a solar god, he's all about justice, because, solar deities, they tend to sort of see everything, and, even to the sort of darkness of men's heart, they can kind of see it all. And so Shamash is like that, but Ishtar has a really important role in justice as well, in that she helps to carry out justice and maintain cosmic order. And so part of that is quite positive. So it's in her sort of loving relationship with her brother that she's involved in this sort of thing. But at the same time, it's that kind of war aspect where part of that order is carrying out revenge. And she is all about revenge. And but that's part of maintaining order. If people transgress against her or against, the king or so forth, then that's part of her power, is to have the ability to carry out her vengeance.
It's just so interesting. I find all this so interesting. Yes, because she encompasses a number of roles there, but as you say, they're all related. So I can't remember, I'm so sorry. Did the Mesopotamians have a large pantheon of gods, or did they have a smaller number that took on a number of different aspects?
Oh, they had quite a large pantheon, but their primary deities, not so many. So there's lots of little gods all over the place, but then the primary gods, not so many, and did shift around and shuffle about a little bit. And you see that in Ishtar's mythology as well, because the other thing you should know about Ishtar is she is super ambitious. I mean, there is really nothing that she sees as being beyond what she deserves. And so there's this amazing story about how she goes and visits the god of wisdom, Enki. This is Inanna, who's Sumerian Ishtar. And she visits him and she gets him drunk. And then she steals the cosmic powers from him and sails away on her boat with her faithful maidservant, Ninshaba. And Enki gets very upset about it and sends all these sea monsters after her to try and stop her, but it's too late. And so she ends up having all the May, and I think it's an etymological story of how those powers were transferred from one city to another. But we see this quite a lot with Ishtar, and she's very handy at, if she ever gets into any trouble, she's very handy at knowing whose door to knock on in order to get back out again.
She sounds a fabulous woman. Has she been adopted by feminist writers or thinkers these days?
She has been a small amount, but I really feel that there is just a gold mine there with Ishtar for the feminist movement. She has this amazing myth where she is actually the victim of sexual violence. And so a gardener assaults her, and she wakes up and realizes what's happened. And then she realizes what's happened, and she hunts him down. And she sends all these amazing curses out onto the land, and there's like a river of blood. And then I think there's a massive dust storm. And then I think the third curse is actually a traffic jam. But after all of that, she finds him, and then she punishes him horribly, because, revenge is her thing.
Fantastic. So who are the other main deities at this time, along with Ishtar?
Well, you often see Enlil as being considered to be sort of the chief of the pantheon, and then later you've got Marduk, who we discussed a little bit earlier. You've got Ea, who's Sumerian Enki, is always around and doing something interesting, who's the god of wisdom. An, or Anu, the sky deity, who is Ishtar's father in a lot of myths. And of course you've got Shamash, who's Sumerian Utu, the the solar deity. And obviously I can't forget Ereshkigal, who is Ishtar's sister, who is the queen of the underworld.
Okay. I hesitate to tear myself away from these wonderful figures, but we should probably just go back to another reader question that we have, which is an interesting one because I know that you've written about how modern comics keep myths alive, which I think is really fantastic. But we have a question from Neil. He asks, what do historians think of video game companies like Creative Assembly with their Total War series, Paradox with their unique historical grand strategy titles, and Ubisoft with its open world Assassin's Creed games and its Discovery Tours, and how video games are investing back into the historical academic community?
Wow. Look, I can't speak for all historians, but this historian thinks that these things are fabulous. Because I feel like video games give us such a potential to look at the historical world in a different way and to engage with it in a different way. So your reader was talking about the Total War series, and I think there's a Total War Rome that has been extremely popular in that it gives that sense for the person who's playing it of being really immersed in the history. Of course, there's always going to be people who say, look, these things need to be more historical, they're not historical enough. Sometimes you'll see figures getting conflated or things not following exactly the timeline or being exactly historically accurate. However, I will say that from teaching, one of the things that I love about teaching is that when you meet people who are passionate about the historical world and you talk to them about it, often that passion could be sparked by something as simple as having watched a movie that they loved as a child that, showed them the Spartans at war, or, a game that they played that led them on to want to find out more. And so I feel like these things have such a huge potential to really feed our curiosity about what happened before.
I agree. Tell me more a little bit of the modern comics keeping ancient myths alive.
Oh, well, I think that is super fascinating because some of these comic book writers, or at least all of the ones that I've come across, are so they're so informed about the things that they're writing about. When I started reading about comics about Ishtar and Gilgamesh, the comic book professionals that I was talking to about this, they just really knew their myth and they really knew their history, and they were able to bring it to life in this fabulously engaging way. And I really feel that, particularly for the field of Mesopotamia, because it is a tiny little field and often be overlooked, I feel that if you can introduce people in an appealing way to this world, then I feel like that just benefits everyone. And at the same time, I feel like it gives the comic professionals lots of really fertile ground to write about. And you can see that with Gilgamesh, because we were talking about him before, about how, he has this sort of wild man sidekick Enkidu, and they have an epic romance. They are so in love with each other. But then in the comic books, in the Marvel comics, Gilgamesh's bromance, his best bro, is Captain America, which is a really fabulous combination if you think about it, because Gilgamesh in the Marvel universe is, miles away from home. He's not in Mesopotamia anymore. And Captain America is also disjointed from the time that he belongs in. He's sort of been brought into the future. And so they're just really well suited. And it's a really clever way of talking about their characters and their identity by kind of juxtaposing it with this history and myth.
So have they, in fact, the modern comics actually taken most of the characters, you think, from historical figures?
Well, I'm sure they've come up with some of their own, but at the same time, it's hard to think of pretty much any character from the ancient world that hasn't at some point fueled some sort of comic book engagement. Living in Australia, there are some amazing, Indigenous heroes in the sort of, superhero world now, which is wonderful. So, yeah, they're prolific.
Fantastic. And also, this is just on the same theme. Can video games present history in a better light, perhaps than the Hollywood epic, which is now presumed to be defunct in showing historical periods at all?
Wow, that's a bit of a scathing indictment of, of the film industry. Look, I really think it depends, doesn't it? I mean, it really depends on the quality of the video game, and it depends on the quality of the film. But I am intrigued. I haven't played enough historical video games to know whether being actually immersed as a player in the game would give you a totally different perspective than sort of more passively sitting and watching a film. So I do think there's huge potential there, and it's an interesting question. But, I mean, Gilgamesh is going to be one of Marvel's new Avengers in the film that comes out. I think it's this year or next year. So, maybe there's hope for the film industry.
I didn't know that, actually. So is he a new character that they're introducing?
Yes, I think
new, as in.
Yes, new but old.
Yes.
Yes, he's one of the Eternals, so he's going to be in the one. I think Angelina Jolie is in it. I'm not sure who's playing Gilgamesh, but it's very exciting.
Your most recent book is about turtles, and we mentioned them earlier. So can you tell us a little bit more about them, perhaps?
Okay, so turtles, wow, they're kind of amazing. There are a lot of different kinds of turtles in the world. So there's 361 known species of turtle out there at the moment. When I wrote the book, which wasn't that long ago, there were only 357 of which we knew. So it's really interesting to see how that field is just so dynamic and constantly evolving. And I guess some of the interesting things that I found about turtles when I looked at their cultural history was, just to bring us back to our comic book discussion, I think the world's most famous turtles are, of course, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I mean, it's indisputable. But what's really interesting about the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is they're actually the latest in a long line of warrior turtles that just goes all the way back, even to ancient Mesopotamia. There's this amazing story about, in one of the world's oldest known stories, is Ninurta and the turtle. And Ninurta is this amazing, powerful warrior god / hero. The line in ancient Mesopotamia is blurry. But he is sent on this amazing quest because the Tablet of Destiny has been stolen by the Anzud bird, which is this giant bird that's sometimes also translated as the Thunderbird, which I actually really prefer to Anzud bird because it just sounds really exciting. But anyway, Anzud is probably more correct. So the Anzud bird runs off with the Tablet of Destiny, which is this tablet where all the fates are written down, and whoever controls the Tablet of Destiny controls the fate of the whole world. And so the gods are like, we need to get the tablet back. Let's send out Ninurta, the hero. He'll rescue it. So Ninurta's like, fine, I can do that, no problem. And he goes out and fights with the Anzud bird, gets the tablet. And then the gods are like, well, just name your reward, Ninurta. And he's like, look, I don't think there's anything you can give me that I'm going to like as much as this new tablet that I got. And so he decides that he's just going to hang on to the Tablet of Destiny and control the whole world. So therefore, we've got Ea, the god of wisdom, who's like, well, we're going to have to foil this somehow. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an attack turtle. So he fashions this attack turtle out of clay, and then he releases it to chase down Ninurta, which it does. And it sort of savagely scratches at him with its claws, and it bites at his ankles, and it digs a pit that he falls into. And then eventually they retrieve the Tablet of Destiny, and the myth ends with the turtle continuing to attack Ninurta. Because apparently once you set an attack turtle in action, it's very hard to turn them back off again. So yeah, so it's quite amazing. And you see warrior turtles all throughout history in different times. And so they're tough little guys. I think it's the whole shells as shield thing.
I was going to say, when you're thinking of fashioning a creature to go and attack somebody, you'd think maybe of a lion or a tiger. You wouldn't necessarily think of a turtle.
This is exactly right. And yet, in history as well, they often turn up in their shells have been actually used for people as shields in sort of South America, and they turn up at funny times on sort of battlefields and that kind of things as pets. Often we see them sort of in Gallipoli and that kind of thing as people with turtle pets. So yeah, and they have inspired some of the earliest types of sort of military warcraft that you'll see on the water. There's a Gobuksun, which is the Korean warship that has like a turtle tail and it breathes fire. And then you've got the American turtle, which is the world's first known submarine, which was created in the American Revolutionary War, I think around 1725. That may not be quite the right date. But David Bushnell was the person who made it. And it was to attack the British fleet that were in the New York harbor. And this submarine, like, if you're interested in like naval history at all, you should definitely look it up, because if you can imagine, like, I'm not sure that I would enjoy being in an actual submarine now, but this submarine, it's made largely of wood and tar. You can fit one person in it, and to move it, you hand crank it. And so the soldier that they sent in this thing must have just been like the most courageous person ever and the most committed. And so the idea was that the submarine, the American Turtle, which was designed because it looked like a turtle, was sort of to sneak up to the fleet and then affix a mine, but it didn't quite work. But there's an amazing series of letters that you can actually access online between George Washington and Thomas Jefferson talking about the American turtle and how they consider it to be such a work of genius.
That's fascinating. I wonder how on earth he was supposed to attach the bomb to the ships. You know, did he have to then swim out of his turtle to sort of to get to them, or how they envisaged he was going to do that? I'm sorry to keep asking. So, what made you focus on turtles though in the beginning? Was it because of this historical link that got you thinking about them? Where did turtles come from?
Well, I think that like they're a very interesting animal and they're quite mysterious. The Egyptians actually called them the mysterious ones because they live so much of their lives submerged. Also, I should say that the Egyptians are the one culture that I found that don't seem to really like turtles very much. And I think it's because, they submerged in the darkness, whereas they kind of worship the sort of solar deity. And so they're considered to be sort of in opposition to one another. That being said, the turtle experts that I talked to were like, yes, well, that makes sense because some of the turtles that live in Egypt are quite vicious. So it's another one of those stories where the myth reflects reality. But yeah, so they're fascinating in their own right. But at the same time, I always like to have a personal connection to whatever I'm writing about, just because I just think that makes it more meaningful. And for turtles, I think with turtles, I was really hoping that because, I've been sort of trying to move things along with my career and been quite busy. And I thought, well, maybe I can learn from the turtle. Maybe I can learn to just take my time. Nobody rushes a turtle, right? You can try, but it's not going to work. And I thought, this is going to help me. I'm going to slow down to the turtle pace and write the turtle book. And just learn something from a creature that is, over 100 million years old. I'm not sure it really worked, but, there's still time to learn from the turtle.
That's wonderful. So, of course, I have to ask, what's your next book? Is it going to be a Mesopotamian goddess or god, or is it going to be another animal?
Well, thank you for asking. Neither. So what it's going to be, I'm writing for a series on the natural world, and my book in the series is going to be a cultural history of wind.
Okay. Okay.
Yes, and so I thought this sounded fascinating because wind is really related to religion in a lot of ways, obviously because it's invisible but powerful. It's often related to magic. I thought, there's so many interesting things to explore here. But now that I've started writing it, the more I realize that wind is everywhere and has been since like before the planet was formed, because there's, solar wind and there's cosmic wind. And it's everywhere, it's all the time, and every culture. So it's a large project. I'm not sure the turtles would approve of the size of the project that I've picked up with wind, but it's not dull. The first thing that I found that I'm really interested in, and I don't know why it's like this, is wind in pretty much every culture I've looked at. Nobody seems to just look at wind as a blanket force. And pretty much every culture seems to see your cardinal winds, your east, west, north, south. Seems to be a thing of just so many different cultures. And you wonder why. Why is that such a part of our, human concept of nature, that winds come from four directions?
Do you think it might be because, and this is off the top of my head and I have no idea about these sort of things, but winds coming from different directions bring different things, like often from the south, would I be right in saying that they were warm? And then if they're coming from a certain direction, they might be coming from the sea. Do you know what I mean? So I wonder if it's because the different winds have different personalities, shall we
Yes.
say, or different characteristics.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And that's what you do see in the myths, totally, is that the myths of different winds reflect different characters for those winds. And often there's some overlap between different cultures of how they'll characterize a particular wind. For example, the east wind, usually, like for example, in the Hebrew Bible, the east wind and in Mesopotamia, they're both considered to be quite a difficult wind to get along with. The south wind in Mesopotamia, that's an evil wind. But yeah, there's a whole myth about one of the winds in Mesopotamia getting its wing broken because it gets cursed, and then that's another sort of a divine slight that needs to be rectified. So yeah, it's just really interesting how people conceptualize these natural forces in such intriguing ways.
Fantastic. So when will you complete that?
In theory, at the end of the year.
Louise, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today. Thank you very much for your time.
Oh, thank you so much, Fiona. I very much enjoyed it.